Dr. Wall, I know that you have had a really fascinating trajectory that has led you to become really a pioneer in the fields of psychiatry and biomedical data science. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background in initially evolution and diversity of species that has led to computational genomics in moss and plant data that has now led you to your fascinating research in autism?
Yes. I think I'm a Renaissance biologist in a lot of ways. The initial appeal to me for evolutionary biology was to understand how species evolve, what a species is, how to define it, and essentially to track the evolutionary trajectories of something, because I found that to be just completely fascinating, especially at a gene level. We were digging into at this time, fairly basic, but still at the time complex levels of genetic diversity, where we have to go in and identify genes that have consistent rates of change that can be calibrated to be a molecular clock, in a sense, so that you could actually identify the speciation events essentially as they happen. The algorithms that we needed to use at the time hadn't really even been developed yet, and so it required, computer science and sort of applied math procedures, and then into some statistical learning approaches. We're coding in C to create these new programs to identify biases in the genetics that no one had really seen before, or patterns in the genetics that nobody had seen before, codon usage biases and stuff like that, so we could really dig in and understand the evolutionary change. So that was an appeal, but also there was this program at NSF called the Project for Expanding Expertise in Taxonomy. It's essentially the program that for me was like Indiana Jones for biologists. And so I spent time reading the literature, and I found this plant that preferentially grew on coconut trees in tropical islands that hadn't been studied rigorously before. Very little taxonomic understanding of this particular group. And it particularly seems to have diversified across the Paleotropic region, so from French Polynesia to, let's say, Madagascar, potentially Malaysia, areas like that. And so I naturally had to go to those islands and to the coconut trees and find out what was going on. Those were close to beaches where there was decent waves.
Wow. And so then that eventually led you to doing kind of more computational bioinformatics work, which then eventually you found interesting to be applied to kind of psychiatry.
Yeah, so, right, I paid my dues for island hopping. I spent a lot of time in the lab sequencing genes and figuring out how to program and, how to create these models, these math models, which led me to think about computational genetics more broadly. I was awarded a fellowship for a postdoc here at Stanford, working with Mark Feldman in the Center for Computational Genetics, which was really, really exciting, really fascinating stuff, because we're starting to get the first sort of whole genome sequence data from yeast and from other organisms, and so we could really dig in and do more. But I really wanted to find a way to make it applicable to something I cared deeply about. I am married to a woman whose sister is severely autistic, and have known her since I was in high school, and so I've spent quite a bit of time with. I was as a high school student spending a lot of time with her and her family and understanding Becky. Becky is Abby's, my wife's sister, and she has a lot of challenges and a lot of contributions to the family's well-being, and I think in a lot of ways those challenges and opportunities that come are exciting, growth areas for the family, and for me it was really, really exciting to watch and see and be a part of. But I also wanted to really understand what autism is and how to make a difference, how to help families like my wife's family understand the condition and treat the condition, diagnose it better, and things like that. The diagnosis, of course, was challenging at first and to get, and then once received, the treatments that are useful are variable in quality, and so I wanted to really find opportunities to make an impact in that area. Naively, I thought that this would be, stepping for genetics, basically, we know that there's a high concordance between identical twins for autism. So there's clearly a genetic story to be told, but so far at that time, no one had really figured it out. And so my naive intuition was like, okay, we'll start looking at genetics first, which is what I did as I got recruited to Harvard Medical School as a faculty member in systems biology in the Center for Computational Biology, which became the Center for Biomedical Informatics. And so my lab began focusing more on the applied computational genetics for making a difference in autism.
And what I found to be most interesting about kind of your work is, in contrast to many other data scientists who have sought to generate signal from a lot of really noisy data, much of your research has really focused on developing higher quality data and diagnostic methods for assessing and diagnosing autism. So can you talk a little bit about the issues with the prior methods developed 20, 30 years ago, and how you found in your research machine learning to really be useful in increasing the efficiency and accuracy of making that initial diagnosis?
Yes, so when I started my career as an assistant professor, I started getting access to gene expression profile data from kids with and without autism. And long story short, there wasn't much of a signal there. But I worried about the labeling. I worried, we're being told these children have autism. How do we arrive at that conclusion? And is there any variability with that class that's assigned to those kids? And as it turns out, so what I decided to do was go and train on the traditional, the standard of care essentially that's being utilized today, which includes a number of potentially useful tests, instruments that are meant to assess specific behavioral abnormalities in the kids. One of them is called the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, which is this thing, the ADOS, which is very widely used, often required to get to qualify for reimbursement for treatment. This is a clinical exam that takes place in a clinical facility that can be difficult to get to. It's geographically, disconnected from the families who need to go there. And once there, this exam could take 40, 60 minutes in length, and then there's a scoring procedure that happens after the fact. So there's an artificiality to it. There is a level of subjectivity to it. But importantly, it's cumbersome in terms of its time consumption, right? So there's the driving distance, there's the waiting list that inevitably exists at these sites because there are only so many of them. They're outnumbered by the number of kids who need to be assessed and so forth. And so, I wanted to find a way to make a difference there, and also to make the outcome for class more digital as opposed to yes, no, binary, subjective. And so we decided, sort of fortuitously, that exam has been so widely used that the electronic medical record data are quite rich. The administration of the exam has been recorded in digital format as categorical ordinal data, typical, sandbox for machine learning, basically, supervised machine learning experiments. And so we ran a series of experiments on these data, trying to predict class and looking at what features are being utilized in, let's say, cross folds of a feature selection process. And it turns out that of the many that are being used today in the standard of care for behavioral assessment, only a very, very small number are actually needed to arrive at the same outcome, the best estimate clinical diagnosis. And so that kind of catalyzed my thinking around, if that's true, then perhaps we can move this away from the clinical establishment into more remote locations, ideally on a phone, utilizing more available technologies that many families already have.
Now, kind of building off this concept of increasing and really democratizing quality care to patients in a landscape where there's increasing, reimbursement criteria, there's, as you alluded to, kind of limited resource allocation and supply of specialty clinics. You've done some of the initial validation work. What are kind of the next steps? What's the future for this technology and really widespread implementation to patients and their caregivers?
So we've published a number of validation experiments. We've shown that we can detect these small number of behaviors in home video, relatively unstructured home video, less than 2 minutes in length, that the overall procedure takes about 4 minutes, probably less, that it can be repeated, that there can be multiple independent observations made on the child to really safeguard against any biases. Moreover, it's a persistent medical record, right? So it carries with you as a parent. You can share it. You can say, here's my child, here's the assessment. And these observations can be redone, and you can use it for tracking and monitoring progress and so forth. So that's just to kind of round out where we are with the technology, but we've also been moving it into different countries. We're working with Dr. Gary Darmstadt here in the Department of Pediatrics, who is really a co-investigator on our ability to move this into Bangladesh, for example, where the cultural differences are pretty stark from the American population that we've studied so far. But nevertheless, we've just published a paper that shows that we can do it there, that the efficacy is similar to what we can show in the American population. And so the likelihood of globalization and really sort of, as you said, democratizing the access and the ability to arrive at a rapid diagnosis is very, very real, and I think in the near future will become available. I should also say that we've licensed at least the initial technologies that I developed out of Harvard to a company here in Silicon Valley called Cognoa, COGNOA.com, and they're carrying it forward with FDA regulatory oversight, which right now the FDA has provided breakthrough designation for this as a diagnostic, and they're evaluating it as a regulated diagnostic in the future. So with that, we hope we will have insurance reimbursement available in the United States anyways, while we continue to move this into different countries where there are severe access issues, under resources and stuff like that.
That's amazing. That sounds like a really promising application of a technology that can be utilized, on an international scale.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the
My
time
pleasure.
to share your perspectives with us here
Sure.
at Big Data.
All right. Thank you.